And that specifically is them, right? If I just eat this fruit, even though God told me not to eat it, I'll be better, I'll be more like God, and what can be wrong with that? Amen? Right? And God placed us in the garden, placed us in his creation, perfect. Each and every one of you, in the mind of God, created in your mother's womb, perfect. Create perfect communion with God. Amen?
And we could even almost say that that was like one of the first lies, implied whenever, the enemy came to Adam and Eve, that it was almost implied like, well, of course it's not perfect. There's something wrong, right? Surely.
Amen. Yeah. That it's the basis of the first lie, and it's what creates the separation between us and God. In thinking that one, it wasn't complete and there's something that we've got to do, and two, that we're not perfect. You remember, those of you that have been here over the last several weeks as we've gone through this, is what created the brokenness is we began to see God differently, right? We saw ourselves differently, and we began to see God differently based on what we thought we were. Adam was in the garden. He was resting in the garden. He's resting in God's Sabbath. He's naked and he's unashamed. As soon as he steps outside of the rest of God, it says his eyes were opened, he realized he was naked, and he was ashamed. He saw himself as imperfect. As soon as he saw himself as imperfect, he started to paint God with a different picture. And that picture was that God was angry, that he was disappointed, that he was mad, that he saw Adam as shameful. Amen? And what God has done since then is to bring us back to the truth that he sees us as perfect, as a completed creation, one that he loves and cherishes and wants to be in relationship with. And so he's drawing us back to that notion. And so he continually tells us to keep the Sabbath and remember it, because the Sabbath is telling us, if you'll just come back and rest in me, then we can go back to the perfection of creation, right? You stepped outside of that rest. Amen? Right? So Sabbath is way more than just honoring a day. So when we see Jesus, I want us to understand here, and I don't know if we're probably getting close to wrapping up for today, because we're going to go through from a whole nother basis to get to the same thing next week, talking about this same subject, okay? But I want us to see that when Jesus is doing these miracles, and throughout his ministry on earth, fully 25% of his miracles, he did 37 distinct miracles throughout the Gospels, right, that are written down. Says he did many other things. But of those, fully 25% of them were done on the Sabbath directly, right? And to the Jews, to the religious system of the time, Jesus was breaking the law. His disciples were breaking the law, because the understanding of Sabbath and the law had been so twisted in the minds of the religious that they missed the point, and we still do today. Amen? We think that the Sabbath is somehow about us setting aside time for God and doing something for God, right? What did Jesus say about the Sabbath?
Said he's the Lord of it.
He said he was the Lord of the Sabbath, but he completely contradicts that by saying, was the Sabbath made for man, or man for the Sabbath? Because in the religious system, man was made for the Sabbath, was under the burden of the Sabbath, right? In God's economy, in Jesus' words, is the Sabbath, the rest, was made for man. Amen? Go ahead, brother.
I hear two things here in all this story. The first one is the lack of trust, that we didn't trust God. And now he's calling us to trust him.
Amen. Yeah.
That's kind of all I hear, because if we don't trust God, we can't rest in his peace. If we don't trust God, we don't believe in this miracle. So the first
That's
thing
right
is
on.
that we didn't trust him in the beginning, and he say, hey, trust me. Right. That's what I hear.
Yeah, he has spent the last thousands and thousands of years to draw us back into the trust that he created us to live in from the very beginning. God didn't change. As I want to continue to reiterate that, God didn't change because of what Adam or Eve did. Adam and Eve changed, and the way that they saw God changed. Amen? God's love for us and his steadfastness stayed the same throughout all of these things. What he's doing by all of his working with man and setting man apart and instituting things like the Sabbath and instituting the law and ultimately coming in the flesh as a man and giving himself on the cross was to show us that he hasn't changed, to change our mind back to trusting and believing in him. Amen? Right?
I think there's God only asks two things of man. It's surrender and man, I had two S's. I was totally gonna go past red on this one, and I was listening. Surrender and submission. There we go. We have to surrender ourselves to him and submit to his will, which, like you said, it requires trust. I'm not gonna submit myself under leadership that I don't trust. We have to surrender what we think is good, what our vision is, and then fall under him.
Amen. So let's explore that just a little bit, right? So when we think of surrender and we think of submission, in most of our minds, we're thinking about giving up, right? We're thinking about like that somebody has defeated us, and therefore we've got to either surrender to them, right, or we've got to submit, like UFC, right? Somebody get you in a leg lock, right? About to break your arm, you're going to tap out, you're going to surrender, right? Is that what we're talking about in the mind of God and in our relation to God? Submission and surrender are not weak things. They're understanding there's no way I can do this.
But we think of humility as a weakness, and actually it's a strength. And surrender and submission require humility.
And again, why would he want us to be humble? Because I just want us to get this, because we can turn all of these things into works. Surrender, submission, humility, we can turn them all into works.
I would even say
that be rest.
That every single one of those can be bad if it's not with the intent of doing it to God, right? Like every single one of those can be a bad thing when you are going outside of what God actually intended, you know?
Yeah, so I mean, we could just look again at the story of Hezekiah, which is why I was prompted to talk about that. Is that Hezekiah had done all of the things that he thought were going to be necessary to protect him and his people, and none of that did any good at the end of the day. He was still going to be overtaken. He was still going to be crushed. It wasn't until the moment that he tore his clothes and he went to God. He's not going to God begging. If we read that psalm again, he's acknowledging, man, how crazy was I from the very beginning to not just trust my God and rest in him. I mean, I tried to appease this guy by ripping the gold off the walls of the temple. And the biggest thing that they have to worry about is food and water. They took care of the water through covering that thing, but now there's got to be food, right? And maybe for as much as 3 years. And God tells him through Isaiah, he says, this year the ground is going to give forth abundantly of itself. You're not going to even have to till it. You're not going to have to work it, right? He said next year it's going to give you even more.